Great day, learners. It's me again, Miss Bethel. So we're almost done discussing summation notation. So let's proceed now with double summation. So in our previous learning videos, for sure you're already familiar with, or you have already mastered summation, sum of squares, square of a sum, product of sums, sum of products. So now let's proceed with DS or double summation. I've mentioned in our previous learning videos that if we happen to see two sigma signs, so these are actually sigma signs, this one, these two are actually sigma signs or capital sigma notations. So in terms of classifying whether it's product of sums or sum of products, we could easily say that seeing two sigma signs could actually denote that it is product of sums. But that's a different story when we talk about seeing two sigma signs that are close together. Because in product of sums, we see a sigma sign because we get the summation of the first variable, let's say x, then the summation of the second variable, let's say y, then multiply those two summations. That's why it's called product of sums. But sa case na ito, we are actually seeing the two sigma signs together. Magkatabi po sila. So ito po ay tinutukoy natin ang double summation. So let's start defining what is double summation. So double summation is applied in a two-way table. Earlier, lahat po ng ating mga discussions, we are actually referring to one-way table. Now, we are actually upgrading because we are trying to discuss two-way table or in two-dimensional arrays. So a two-way table is composed of R rows, or usually we designate these R rows as P rows. And then this also composed of the C, the columns, or the R columns, which we are trying to refer to the replication. So ito po yung dapat nating pakatandaan. R rows or P rows. So R po kasi rows, pero yung ginagamit natin ay P, yung common notation natin. P rows at saka instead of using C for columns, we use R because yung columns po natin, yun pong mga replications. So again, P rows, then R columns. So we have here the notation. So we are actually seeing two sigma signs, then we are seeing Xij. So Xij is the formula of the term. Then we are seeing two index of summation, I and J. So the first index of summation starts with 1 up to P rows or column? P rows. And then J here starts with 1 to R, what? R columns. Again, P rows, R columns. So we have already dissected the parts of this notation. Now let's try to read this properly or statistically. So this can be read as the summation of Xij from I equals 1 to P rows, and J equals 1 to R columns. And another thing, this also means that the sum of the values of the two-way table with P rows and R columns could be read as summation of Xij from I equals 1 to P and J equals 1 to R. So if we're going to expand this double summation notation, we will have this lengthy terms. So let's try to use the first two rows. So these are actually the values for the first row and the values for the second row. Ma'am, paano nyo po nasabi na ito po ay first row at ito po ay second row? Kasi alam natin na ang index of summation na I, ang nire-refer niya ay ang row. Paano ba nasabi na row? Kasi alam natin na P is row. But what if in some other literatures, yung ginagamit nila ay M or L or N? You would know because it would be mentioned naman in the problem set. Just don't be confused, no? Whenever you would encounter another letter or another variable. But for this case, we know that P represents rows and R represents the columns. So X11, paano ba to? X11 or X11 or X11? So this is how we are going to read this. So X row 1, column 1. X row 1, column 2. X row 1, column 3. Until you would reach, okay, here, the last column, which is R, found on the first row. And then since this is summation, we're going to add the values found in the second row. So X row 2, column 1, X row 2, column 2, we're referring to the values in this position. And then the value found at X row 2, column 3, until you would reach the very last value on the second row, which is X row 2, column R. Then we have here XP1. P stands for the rows. So to the infinite row, having the first column, okay, the XP, the second column, and the row P or the P row having the third column, and of course, the last value, which is the XP row and the R column. So, ganun po kadali magbasa ng double summation. Huwag po kayong matakot kapag nakikita niyo po na masyado pong madaming sigma sign, saka madami pong X, madami pong subscript. Please do not be afraid. So long as you know how to read this and how to expand this, then you will really get the correct answer. So let's have another definition, of course, pertaining to double summation. So at times, our data may be classified according to two criteria. For example, we could actually represent, so in a study, the amount of gas released when a chemical experiment is run at I temperature level. So I is for temperature and J is for pressure. So we need to know the sum of the observations that we have noted. So for us to do this, it's very convenient to do or to use double summation notation. Because try to imagine we are trying to represent, okay, to check on the amount of gas release in a chemical experiment. And there are two factors affecting the amount of gas release. First is the ith level, which is the temperature. And the second one is the jth level, which is the pressure level. So we also can encounter this in some literatures. So this is actually double summation. So the symbol means that we first sum over the subscript J. So this first summation, this one is we're going to sum over the subscript J using the theory for single summation. So we are actually treating these two individually or separately. And then after summing, or getting the summation of this notation, then we perform the second summation by allowing I, this one, to assume values from L or from 1 here. I use 1 here. 1 to M. Okay? I hope that's clear with you. So I am showing this to you for you not to be confused if ever you would see N and M. So J here, so this one is for what? Rows or columns? Okay, for the columns. And this one is for the rows. So in this example, we use M rows and N columns. But don't worry because in most of our problems that we will be using P rows and R columns. I just showed this to you for you not to be shocked when you see in other literatures na M at saka N yung ginagamit nilang superscripts to designate rows at saka columns. So hence, the data in the following table would tell us the amount of gas released in a chemical experiment driven by two factors. We have the temperature and the pressure. So I again, we are referring to the temperature, and J, so column, pressure. So paano ba to? So this is actually the first row and the second row. So lahat ng values na ito ay part ng row 1. So the first temperature at lahat ng values na ito ay part ng row 2. Okay? Row 2 or the second temperature. This one is for 1R. The first column or the first replication, then the second column or the second replication, the third column or the third replication, and the fourth column or the fourth replication. So we read this as row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2, row 1, column 3. That's why we have x13. Row 1, column 4. That's why we have x14. Then for row 2, so row 2, column 1. That's why we have x21. Row 2, column 2. That's why we have x22. Row 2, column 3. That's why we have x23. And then row 2, column 4. That's why we have x24. So, madali ba or mahirap? Actually, madali lang po siya. Don't be confused na bakit 1, 1 at saka 1, 2 row at saka column. So, kung may mga values dito, for example, x11 or x row 1, column 1, meron siyang 10 na value dito. So, yun yung gagamitin mong value. Ito po ay nagsasabi sa atin lamang ng position ng value sa ating two-way table. Para po siyang guide natin. Okay, pagka sinabing ano ba ang value ng row 2, column 2, then masasabi natin, itong value na ito. Okay, ang value na matatagpuan sa position na ito, yun yung sagot. Okay po ba? I hope po na naiintindihan natin. So we have here a double summation notation. Let's try to evaluate this one. Actually, the values here are based on this previous table. So we have here the summation of xij as I goes from 1 to 2. Ibig sabihin, meron po tayong dalawang rows. At saka, as j goes from 2 to 4. So, meron pong 4 na columns, pero ang atin pong i-consider ay yung mga values po na tinutukoy lamang ng columns 2 hanggang 4. Okay, yun po ang ibig sabihin. So, to evaluate this, the very first thing to do upon seeing a double summation notation is for you to treat each notation separately. To treat these notations having two entities. Ano po? So, ito pong summation notation na ito, ang una natin i-treat. Ito po yung nasa ating kanan. Okay. So, ang tinutukoy dito ay summation of xij. Alam po natin na ang values lamang ng I ay nagre-range ng 1 at saka 2. So, pwede po natin kopyahin. Summation of xij. So, alam po natin na ang x po ay may I at saka j na in summation index. So, ilagay po natin dito na hanggang 2. Nagsisimula po sa 1 hanggang 2. So, atin pong e-expand ang formula of the term na ito, xij. So, alam naman po natin na ang values lamang po ng ating columns na j ay nagsisimula sa 2 hanggang 4. So, we have here I, hindi pa po natin papalitan ang values ng I kasi tinutukoy po natin dito na hanggang 2 lang po siya. So, hindi po natin siya pwedeng palitan na muna or i-substitute. So, xi2, kasi po 2 nagsisimula, tapos xi3 at saka xi4. So, now we could see one similar term or one term which is actually very familiar to us kasi isa lang po yung ating nakikitang sigma sign. So, is this the final answer? Of course not. Because hindi pa po natin na-extract yung ating row or yung ating I. So, alam natin na si I or ang ating row ay dalawa lang. 1 at saka 2. First row at saka second row. So, ngayon po, isa-substitute natin ang values ng row dito sa lahat ng I's. Okay? So, alam natin na dalawa yung ating row. So, una, gumawa tayo ng para sa first na parenthesis para sa ating first row. At saka yung pangalawang parenthesis po para sa ating second row. So, first row, so of course, xi2. So, x first row is 1. So, x12, xi3 is x13 or x row 1, column 3, at saka xi4 or X row 1, column 4. So, tapos na po tayo, di ba? Kasi sabi po natin, hanggang 4 lang po ang ating columns. Tapos nagsisimula sa 2, kaya 2 hanggang 4. Tapos ito po ay sa first na row, kaya lahat po ng ating makikitang row or I dito ay 1. 1, another 1, and the last 1. Ngayon po ay atin pong sagutan ang nasa second row. So alam po natin na x ay 2, kaya second row po, kaya papalitan natin ang I ng 2. Kaya x 2, 2. Row 2, column 2. Tapos x ay row 3 ang column. So, X second row, column 3. X row I, column 4. So, X row 2, kasi alam natin na hanggang 2 lamang, column 4. So, ganun lang po siya kadali. Ay, medyo magulo pa po ba? Medyo naguguluhan po ba tayo? If medyo naguguluhan po tayo, let's have another example. So, let's try to solve the mysteries of double summation. Let's try to make our life easier. So, here po, we are actually encountering another double summation notation. So for this, we have, let's try to read is, first, identify muna natin yung ating mga parts. Meron po tayong makikitang dalawang sigma sign, kaya po double summation, magkatabi po sila. Ito po ang formula ng ating term, I plus J. Alam po natin ang ating mga summation indexes, I at saka J. Yung sa I po, nagsisimula sa 1, nagtatapos sa 3. Yung J naman po, nagsisimula sa 2, nagtatapos sa 4. Again po, ito po ang ating P rows. Ito po ang ating R columns. So kung mai-imagine nyo po, babalikan po natin itong column at saka row na ito. Yung P po, row. Alam po natin na dalawa po. Diba? Dalawa po, diba? Sabi po dito, ay hindi pala, tatlo pala. So tatlong rows po. So imagine nyo po na isang row, pangalawang row, pangatlong row. Okay? Tapos, yung ating column po ay nagsisimula sa 2 hanggang 4. Okay? So, yun po ang ating i-consider. So, to solve for double summations, the first step is to isolate the sigma on the right side. This is our first sigma on the left side and the second sigma on the right side. So, let's try to isolate this first. So, to do that, for us to isolate the right hand sigma notation, this is what we're going to do. The very first thing that we need to know is to check on the index of summation, J. We know that it starts with the second column and ends at the fourth column. So our formula of the term is I plus J. So it's very simple. We just need to plug in the values of the second column up to the fourth column. So we write here, I plus J, so 2 for the second column, I plus J, 3 for the third column, at saka I plus 4, 4 for the fourth column. Now, we're already done expanding, right? The right-hand notation or sigma notation. So this sigma notation now, so this is actually, or this summation notation now rather, this is the format which is more familiar to all of us. Now, we're done extracting the value of J. The very next thing that we need to do is to plug in the values of the row or the I. We know na meron po tayong tatlong rows. Kaya po, ang atin pong gagawin ay, una, kahit po medyo nakakatakot tignan, ay wag po tayong matakot. Dahil po madaming values, madami pong variables, at saka madami pong subscript at saka superscript. So first thing, focus at concentration. So we have already expanded the right-hand notation and we have already plugged in the values of the J summation index. Now, let's proceed with plugging in the values for the I summation index. We know na nagre-range po siya sa tatlong rows or lahat po ng values na part po ng first row, second row, at saka ng third row. Bali po, ang atin pong gagawin, alam po natin na kinakailangan pa natin i-include sa summation ang values ng second column, third column, at saka fourth column. Bali po, pangatlong ulit po natin itong gagamitin. Kaya po andito po sila. Ito po yung mga values ng, hindi makikita yung aking kamay. Yon. Ito po ang values ng first row. Okay? Ito din po ang values ng second row. At saka values po ng third row. Ma'am, bakit po inulit-ulit natin sila ng pangatlong beses? Tapos same lang po ang ating ginamit. Kasi going back to our double summation notation, alam po natin na tatlo po yung rows at saka sa tatlong rows, in each row, we will be using second up to the fourth column. Yun po yun. Yun po ang ibig sabihin nun. Okay? So, since we're again done plugging in the values of the J columns, okay, or our R columns using the J summation index, baka po may malito naman ulit. So, let's plug in the values of the I or the P rows. Okay, so I plus 2, so 1 plus 2, I plus 3, 1 plus 3, I plus 4, 1 plus 4. Tapos na po tayo sa ating first row. Second row na naman po tayo. So I plus 2, 2 plus 2, I plus 3, 2 plus 3, I plus 4, 2 plus 4. We're done with the second row. Tsaka sa third row na naman po tayo. 3 plus 2, kasi po third row, tapos yun po yung value, tapos sa second column din po, tapos sa third row po, tapos pangatlong column po, yun po yung value, tsaka yung third row po at tsaka pang-apat po na column, yun po yung value. So, ang summation po ng row 1, columns 2 to 4 ay 12. Ang summation din po ng ating row 2, columns 2 to 4 ay 15. At ang summation din po ng row 3, columns 2 to 4 ay 18. Kaya, ang sagot po, ang final answer is 45. Hooray! Finally, we're having an accurate answer. So, as easy as that. So, nalilito pa ba? I hope hindi na. So, para naman, mas ma-visualize natin kung paano ba ginagawa sa two-way table yung ating double summation na nakikita. Tignan po natin itong example na ito. Hindi po ako gumamit ng R columns. N columns po yung ginamit ko. Hindi din po ako gumamit ng P rows. M rows po yung ginamit ko. Para po, hindi po tayo ma-whirla. Feel like ma-shock na, oh my gosh, I didn't see it coming. Bakit N at saka M? Eh, yung sinabi ni Ma'am is R lang at saka P. Okay? So, let's try this one. We know that this is easy. So, wala to. X to, X to. Okay? So, I hope hindi kayo yung ma-X, ano? Yung problem set. Kasi madali lang siya. Ayun. So, ready na ba? Handa na ba kayo? I hope so. Okay? So, instead of using X also, I use A. So, we have here the summation of Aij as I goes from 1 to M and J goes from 1 to N. Again po, yung J po natin dito, yun po ang ating columns. Okay. J, bakit di po N, ma'am? Okay. Paliwanag po ulit. Yung J po, yun po ang ating summation index na ang pinapahiwatig niya ay ang mga column na first column hanggang sa nth column. So, kung sasabihin mo hanggang 10th column lang, so, J ang summation index ng columns, tapos nagsistart siya sa 1, nagtatapos siya sa, kunwari, 10th column. Okay. So, clear na ba? Tapos, I naman yung ating summation index dito na ang pinapahiwatig, siya yung nagre-represent ng mga rows, first row hanggang sa last row, which is the end. So, para po ating maisulat ito, ito po yun. Okay? Row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5, until you will reach the last row, which is M. Tapos, 1, 2, N. Okay, kasi po ito po yung ating column. Column 1, column 2, column 3, column N. Clear? So, IJ, kasi po, ito po yung ating formula of the term. So, ang pinakahuli pong value dito ay A, row M, column N. Okay, that's infinity. Depende po kung ano yung given na ending ng ating summation index. Kaya po, N columns at saka M rows. Clear? Again? Row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5, hanggang row M. Ayaw po na walang magsabi, ay ma'am, sorry, hindi ko po naintindihan. Row 10 lang po ako kasi ako noon, nung grade 1 ako. Just kidding. Ayun. Tapos sa end columns naman, so we have here column 1, column 2, column 3, tsaka column N. Again po, ito po yung 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, N. Ito po ang nagsasabi ng position ng values. Okay? Position po ng values na ating tinutukoy na gagamitin. So now let's try having an in-depth understanding about double summation by using your most favorite variable, which is x. Ay, sorry, favorite niyo yung x niya. Yun. So, let's start by understanding this double summation notation. So, we have here summation of xij as I goes from 1 to p. P, of course, refers to the rows. At saka, j goes from 1 to r. We are trying to refer to the columns. So, here, bakit po sinasabi niyo, ma'am, na R po natin ay columns, tapos P po natin ay rows. Tapos dito po sa baba, meron din po nakalagay dito na J columns, tapos I rows. Ano po ba yung totoo? Okay, let's try to clear this out for it not to be vague anymore. Ang I at J po, yun po yung ating summation indexes. Si I po, ang sinasabi niya ay rows. Bali, nag-start po siya sa row 1 hanggang the last row, which is P. Kaya po P rows. Yung J naman po, at tinutukoy niya ay ang columns. Okay? Columns po yung kanyang tinutukoy. Nag-start po siya sa first column hanggang sa pinakalas na column, which is R. So, klaro na po ba? So, para po ma-expand natin ang double summation na ito po ang nangyayari sa kanya. Ang makikita natin pagka gumamit po tayo ng two-way table. So, we know na 1 to P ang rows. So, row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5, row P. Or kung saan po aabot up to infinity po. Depende po kung hanggang ilang P or hanggang ilang rows ang gusto ninyo. Tapos, ang R column naman po. So, ito po, column 1, column 2, column 3, at saka yung hanggang R column. So, bali po, X row 1, column 1, X row 1, column 2, hanggang X row 1, column R. X row 2, column 1, X row 2, column 2, X row 2, column R. Hanggang umabot po tayo sa XP or P row, column 1, XP row, column 2, XP row, column R. Okay? So, yun po ang ating ibig sabihin when we're going to expand this double summation and use a two-way table. So, we have here P rows at saka R columns. Again, it's very important for us to identify the position, right, of the values that we are referring to. Since we already know how to read double summation notation, we also know how to expand it, then how to plug in those arbitrary values in a two-way table. So let's try computing using real numbers, okay, or real values in a two-way table. So I've used here 4 rows and 3 columns. So remember again that when we talk about rows, we are using what summation index? We are actually using I as the summation index. So for this one, since I is our summation index, the range of our summation index starts from 1 to 4 because we have 4 rows. So we have the first row here, the second row, the third row, and the fourth row. So our P is only up until number 4 or like row 4. For our column is designated using summation index J, right? So it's first column, second column, and the third column. So we have here column 1 to the R column, which is number 3 or the third column. And our test is to compute for the following. Double summation of xij, summation xij, summation of xij squared, a collection factor, and the total sum of squares. But before proceeding with this one, let's try to understand first how do we relate the placement to this given values using the arbitrary values. How do we equate with the existing values that we have? Since we know that we have 4 rows, so our I is composed of the first row to the P row, which is 4, and our column is from, the J is starting from the first column up to the R column, which is the third column. So to denote that, we know that it's X11, Xij, Xi is 1, J is 1. It's like X11. Remember, this is I, this is J. So Xij, X1, and then 2 for the G. So row 1, column 2. Xi, which is 1, and J, which is 3. So we have 1, 3, X, row 1, column 3. So to have our total for that, we have summation of Xij. J goes from 1 to 3 because 1, 2, 3. The same is true for the second row, the third row, and the fourth row. So notice for this one, since this is the second row, of course, our X would always start with our I having the value 2. Right? Because this is I, second row. So Xij, X2J. Then J starts from 1, the first column, and 3, the last column. So 1, 2, and 3. So Xij, X, row 2, column 1, row 2, column 2, J is 2. So I is 2, J is 3. So 2, 3X, row 2, column 3. The same, you would do the same for the third column and the fourth column, right? So it's very easy to do this. So replacing the values of this arbitrary or dummy variables. So our row 1, column 1 is 15. Row 1, column 2 is 12. Row 1, column 3 is 13. So we just need to get the summation of the first row. Then get the summation of the second row, the summation of the third row, summation of the fourth row. Ma'am, saan to galing? Saan to galing to mga values na to? Actually, the given is just this table. Ito lang po yung given table. Dinisect lang natin kung paano ba natin ihahalin tulad ito doon sa minimension natin kanina na mga positions ng x variables, right? Ng ating double summation. Para naman mas maintindihan natin, let's try to relate it. The arbitrary values and the real values are the numbers. So let's try to compute now for the double summation. So summation of xij as I goes from 1 to 4 and j goes from 1 to 3. Hindi na po natin siya isinulat kasi given na naman po sa ating two-way table. So row 1, so 15 plus 12 plus 13, that's row 1. The total, get the total or the summation. Then row 2, 5 plus 7 plus 9, galing po dito. Row 3, 21 plus 23 plus 19, this is refracted. Row 4, 9, 10, and 17, so 9 plus 10 plus 17. So the double summation of rows and columns, the answer is 160 because the first row, the sum is 40, the second row, it's 21, the third row, it's 63, and the last row is 36. So the double summation of this two-way table is 160. Ganun lang po siya kadali. Medyo mahirap na po pagka sasabihin na po doon na ang kukunin lang po na double summation ay magsa-start po siya sa row 1 hanggang row 4, tapos column 2 hanggang column 3. Pero hindi naman po siya ganun kahirap. As long as you understand the basic, you could actually get the correct answer. So how about this one? We already have this squared, okay? So it's just what? It's the sum of the squares, right? So it's just the sum of the squares of each value. Diba? Kasi i-square muna natin siya, saka natin ginat yung sum. So 15 squared for row 1, 12 squared, and 13 squared. Ito yon. Tapos 5 squared plus 7 squared plus 9 squared. Ito din po iyon. So, 21 squared, 23 squared, and 19 squared. Ito din po yun. 9 squared, 10 squared, at 17. Yun din po ito. So, 538 plus 155 plus 1,331 plus 470. The answer is 2,494. So, mas maigi po na alam po natin magsulat ng double summation using the arbitrary or the variables or the letter assignments plus the exact value. So, ma-bright na kita ang nagsamot. We're done computing for the double summation of the row and column, summation xij, and the summation of xij squared. We use 1 to 4 for the rows and columns 1 to 3 for the R. So P here is up to 4 and R here is up to 3. Why am I emphasizing this? Because we need this in solving for the correction factor. Because to solve for the correction factor, we simply need to square the summation of xij and divide it by the product of the row and column. Remember that row, we have 4 rows and we have 3 columns. So 4 times 3, that's actually 12. And then squaring the summation of xij, we have 160 squared. So we have 25,600 divided by 12. That's equals to 2,133.33. This is the correction factor. We need this value actually to compute for the total sum of squares. So to compute for the total sum of squares, we simply need to subtract the correction factor from the result of the double summation of xij. So we know that to compute for the correction factor, we need to square the summation of xij and divide it by PR or the rows and columns. We already obtained this value. Actually, this is the value. Remember, it's 2,133.33. So that's actually the correction factor. I just expanded this one. And the summation of xij squared, double summation of xij squared is equals to 2,494. Where did we get this value? From here. Actually, the inputs that we need to use for computing the total SS or the total sum of squares rather are already given. So 2,494 minus 2,133.33 is equals to 360.67. So this is our final answer. So actually, we're done with summation notation. Hooray! We're finally done. So thank you so much, learners, and be deeply blessed. I hope na nakatulong po ang ating learning video para mas ma-appreciate at para po mas maintindihan natin ang summation notation. Akala po natin ay mahirap dahil po sa napakadaming sigma signs at dahil sa napakadaming variables, subscript at superscripts, but then doon po natin marirealize na hindi naman po talaga siya mahirap, kundi siya po ay very enticing or very challenging at saka nakakainganyo po na pag-aralan. So thank you so much for listening. Goodbye and be deeply blessed. See you on our next learning videos.